All right, welcome everybody to another episode of The Art of Prevention. And as always, I have an amazing and awesome guest. And today we're going to be talking about Nordic skiing. And who better to talk about Nordic skiing than the U.S. junior national team coach, Olaf Hedberg. And Olaf grew up in Sweden, and he's been cross-country skiing, and he's been on skis since, well, before he even remembers, before he could even walk. And throughout the process of becoming an extremely high-level Nordic skiing athlete, high-level Nordic skiing coach, and now very high-level adventure racer, he's gleaned many insights and pearls of wisdom that we're going to try and extract today. Olaf, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be on this podcast and share a bunch of information with everybody. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, thank you so much for having me. One clarification, I've been with the junior US ski team at the last couple of junior world championships and U23 world championships. I'm not year round with the US ski team. So just that small clarification. Yes, I am originally from Sweden. I was a cross-country skier in Sweden, trying to make the World Cup team there. I was most of the time ranked between 10th and 15th in Sweden, which means I just missed it. And I never made a World Cup team, unfortunately or fortunately, because now I'm here instead. I had some good conversations with Fredrik Landstedt, who is 4 or 5-time NCAA winning coach in cross-country skiing, and was going to come over as an athlete skiing for him. And I was like, no, I'm going to make the World Cup team. And then I didn't. And yeah, so then it was like, oh, okay, now I'm coming to the US instead. And I was fortunate to become his assistant coach and learned a lot from him, and was coaching University of New Mexico to a 2nd place in NCAAs, I think, and a 4th place and something like that. And I have been in the US for almost 20 years now. Even though my accent has not gone away at all. So, if you don't just interrupt me if something I'm saying doesn't make sense. I've also, like you mentioned, actually done some adventure racing. And I have been, I was 3rd at World Championships in 2017 and been ranked 2nd in the world. On the team that was ranked 2nd in the world. So in terms of knowledge of the body, compared to your other guests, I'm probably the least qualified guest you ever had on this podcast. I'm like a small child. Like I hand, foot, I got that. But in terms, I have some experience of understanding what it takes to become internationally competitive, or towards the top of the world in both cross-country skiing and adventure racing. So I think I can add some perspective from that side, even though I can't, define one muscle versus the other, right? That's not my skill set. And I am being a dad to a 4-year-old guy who consumes a lot of my life at the moment. So that's me. Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully I can share some of my experience or wisdom or something.
Yeah, well, luckily this isn't an anatomy podcast, so we don't have to delve into the specifics of human anatomy, but I think that some of your insights, so if I'm someone who's trying to become a competitive athlete, whether that be an endurance athlete, a strength athlete, whatever, and this goes beyond the sport of cross-country or Nordic skiing, can you become that athlete by getting injured every single year?
Absolutely not. Like,
Exactly.
right? But at the same time, I don't know anyone who has been towards the top of the world in anything who hasn't been injured, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they go hand in hand. Like, you will not become successful, and most of careers end or comes to an end or declines due to injury. That's extremely common.
Yeah.
So having the ability to prevent or minimize that part is so, so important, right? Because you can literally end your career, or it's actually very, very common. I can have several examples from cross country skiing, right? Just we have had NCAA champions, World Cup skiers, all of them getting injured by having to stop their career due to lower back pains and things like that, which you have discussed in length on your previous podcast. So injuries are extremely important to minimize, but at the same time, I don't know anyone who hasn't had to deal with it. Like, if you
Oh
are
yeah.
at the top of the world, you have probably gone through a lot of things that like, it's not something you can take away from. If you are going to be an athlete, you are going to have to deal with this type of issues, like even in a very non-contact sport as cross-country skiing. So
Oh yeah.
I
And
think it's
I
super important.
I completely agree. I mean, having optimal fitness and driving the adaptations for optimal fitness requires a high level of stress to the body and to the psychological system, et cetera. And you're really always riding that razor's edge of doing something that is an optimal training load versus the other side of that fine edge, which is doing something that may lead to injury. And that's one of the
Exactly.
reasons that I wanted to have you on, because you've obviously had a success in coaching. And if you got all of your athletes injured, then you probably wouldn't have that much success, right?
Maybe, most likely not.
And
Uh,
and if we think about this in a sort of backwards scenario, we know what we could do to injure athletes, right?
yeah,
So some people would say, "Oh, you can't prevent injuries. There's no way to prevent injuries." Well, in some ways, we obviously can reduce the risk of injuries because we know what are the factors and variables that we could manipulate to cause injuries. Like if I had your athletes come in and I was their coach and I told them, "Okay, we're going to do a significantly high amount of intensity. We're going to couple that with a lot of volume. And then we're not going to eat it all. And then you're not going to sleep it all either. And then I'm going to yell at you and make you hate the sport." Then, like, we know if I did that, like, the risk of them all getting injured, if they listened to me, which they probably wouldn't, the risk of them getting injured would really escalate.
oh, it's
So,
exponential almost. Like,
yeah.
right, it would be, you would have a very, very injured team. Absolutely, no doubt about that. And yeah, absolutely. And what you talk about, right, is also so important, to have the adaptation of your training. It's not just tolerating your training, it is also adapting to your training. So, just like you're saying, even if we are reducing the risk of injury, but with the right nutrition, the right amount of sleep, the right amount of, all of these things taking care of your body, you can increase the adaptation to the training, which means that then you can increase your load and your volume, and then you adapt better, and then you tolerate, like, so it's not just tolerating the training load or volume, it is adapting to the training load and volume. If I Yeah, like, and what you can do at, with all everything, with cross training, as you discussed in your previous podcast, and all of these things, it's important to look at those things, because one body might be able to handle this volume on on skis, but then they make that transfer from skis to dry land and running, and suddenly there's a whole different component to that, right? Because in cross country skiing specifically, right, you don't cross country ski 365 days a year. We have this thing called summer, and there's there's a big training period, and then there's like this race period. So it's, just like you're saying, there is no way, or I wouldn't say no, there's a very, very small chance of you making it to become internationally competitive if you don't take care of all these other things. I do not know of an example. I'm sure there is one somewhere, but from all my observations is you do not become internationally competitive unless you take care of your body and doing all of those things and trying to make sure that you can adapt to that training.
I hope that you're enjoying this episode of the Art of Prevention podcast. I wanted to let you know about a new resource that is available on our website. And this resource is specifically for runners who want to strength train. So we all know from our previous podcasts and many guests on the podcast that strength training is essential for runners to, one, improve their running economy as well as decrease their chances of injury. For being an awesome listener to this podcast, all you have to do is go onto our website and click on the sports icon and then go down to running, and you'll see that PDF pop up, Strength Training for Runners. And for being an awesome listener, I'm giving a 20% discount if you type in podcast in all caps at checkout. This PDF I hope will help out a bunch of people and get more runners into the weight room with the right types of programming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Now, what are some of the signs that you look out for as a coach with your athlete that tells you that the athlete may be tolerating the training, but not necessarily adapting to that training? They're not soaking up that stimulus and then having super compensation in their physiological system.
So we do. So it's very, this is very interesting. And here I think it's important to differentiate between top level World Cup athletes and high school athletes, because once you are internationally acceptable or internationally competitive or whatever you want to call it, your life becomes much more centered around the sport. When you look at a high school athlete, or once you start getting to college as well, right? There's a lot of things going on. We do baseline testing every month to make sure to see performance development over the last 30 days. The thing with a World Cup athlete is that you can look like, okay, what stress did you come from? Like, how was travel? Did you travel to a different continent? Jet lag? There's, training load. There are not that many inputs. Where you look at a high school athlete, well, you have your training load and training volume as an input, but then there's, and I don't mean to minimize the stress of World Cup skiers, but their lives are much more sharper than the high school athlete who is more like, oh yeah, this, girl I liked said she didn't like me back, and I also ate goldfish for lunch, and then I had this huge test, and for some reason I decided to binge watch this Netflix thing, and I went to bed at 1 a.m. And you're like, nice. Wonder why your baseline testing is worse. So there is those things that high school students do, or middle school. There is not that many on the World Cup level that do those things. So you have a more higher variance in results, even though maybe the training goes well here, right? Versus when you're talking to elite groups, they still do stupid stuff sometimes, right? It's not like they're perfect by any means, but they have a tendency to not have as high variance in this thing that as there. But so we do a baseline test, and then the thing that I think is absolutely key with high school students or high school and is to listen to the athletes. Because all of those examples I just gave, they are not just theoretical examples that I came up with. Like, these are things that actually happen. Like, I didn't bring my running shoes to the running time trial, so I ran in sneakers. Again, totally happens. These are, so you need to have an understanding from the coach to the athlete and have a good communication pattern. You respect the athlete listens to you, you listen to the athlete, that they're like, I did this silly thing, like I didn't have my shoes with me, or I ate goldfish for lunch or whatever. Okay, don't be judgmental and be like, you cannot do that, because they are still just high school students, so they will do silly things. But understand what they're coming from, listen to them, and see what you can adjust. And then don't demand perfection, don't demand international perfection or level from high school students, but try to educate them on what it takes to get there, right? And that's I think a key thing to listen. And then I have the training load for every one of my athletes or former athletes, track their training, they track their volume, they use heart rate monitors, they track so they get a load, and then are the load calculations exact, whatever, that is another podcast by itself. But you can then see their performance with monthly baseline testing versus the load they had, and are they adapting to this, or are they not improving? Are they, in terms of injury prevention, overtraining is a big thing in Nordic skiing. But for many, undertraining is also a thing, right? Where you are now in males producing very high levels of testosterone during puberty, right? And they are maybe not training enough to being able to utilize all this like extra free boost. I don't know if it's free per se, because there is like a lot of hormones going on, but like you can definitely start increasing load and volume there. So
And what kind of baseline testing are you talking about? Like a time trial, or
we do running time trial, very simple. The best, there are ski ergs, which mimics double poling. We also do time trial on roller skis. Roller skis outside is unfortunately not so exact because of wind, and if you have rain or wet surface, it changes the conditions enough. And this is where compared to swimming and running, cross-country skiing becomes a little bit more complex because there's so many other inputs. So the friction coefficient between the ski and the surface changes enough. So outside testing isn't great on that. So instead, if you can, the three things that I have found most beneficial is running. And again, you got to measure running against yourself, not just because if you have a great runner, awesome, you're a great runner, great for running, but you can have a slower person, like you have to compare it to yourself, not against others. Ski erg, extremely high usage in Scandinavia, not as much here, but Concept 2 ski erg's a great tool, and showing double pull capacity. And then lastly, we do have the luxury to here in Summit have a roller ski treadmill, which is absolutely the best testing that we have available to us. And we have skis that don't change. So we have the same, like they are only used for the roller ski treadmill, and you can do excellent testing there and see performance, because then you take away the outside inputs
Mhm.
like weather, friction, yada.
And speaking of baselines, what are some of the physiological baselines that have become so readily available through the use of wearables and technology that you monitor on either yourself or some things that you maybe monitor on your athletes? I mean, we know that now we have so much data that we can look at, from heart rate variability, O2 saturation, all these things. Some of these things matter a ton. Some of these may not matter as much. What sort of things do you look at? What variables do you look at amongst your athletes?
So what you do versus what you do for yourself. This is I am of the belief that the process needs to be enjoyable. If you are at a too early of an age telling a kid you need to do this and 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 this, don't treat kids like you treat elite athletes. They are two different groups. So my top level junior athletes do, training load, training volume, resting heart rate, maybe heart rate variability. When it sleep might go in there too, but this is for the top. If you want to take that step and if you want to become, like looking at internationally, but for a lot of the juniors, we are looking at, are you training enough? Are you training, or are you training and are you having fun? Because if you are going to have fun, you are going to train more. If you enjoy going to practice, you are going to go to practice more often. If you don't like going to practice, it will be harder for you to go to practice. So are you making the process enjoyable is super important. Once we come up, if we look at those that are on an international level, we track resting heart rate. First of all, training volume, training load, time in different zones. How much percentage of your training time is in zone 4 or 5, how much is in zone 3, are you having the right polarization? Are you doing the right periodization, etc.? And then, so that's all during training. And then for passive, we're looking at heart rate variability, resting heart rate, body temperature, and sleep, would be say. Actually, I have not tracked oxygen saturation in any athlete, but it's something that's, those resting inputs. And if we look at I think more and more people, it becomes so easy to track these things now that more and more people are going to be tracking these things, and we're going to be able to build better and better models and better training programs with help of all of these inputs and AI here in over the next 10 years. I see like a revolution in this. The key thing to remember though, we can track all of these things. These are great things to track. Your goal is to be as fast as possible, usually.
Yeah.
Like, there is nothing better than speed, right? And in running and swimming, relatively easy, because it's like in skiing, it's a little bit trickier to know. But the overall goal is to be as fast. It's not to be as well rested as possible. It's not to be and just, you mentioned that, right? You're going to have to train down so you can get a super compensation, very basic. But like you cannot go out and expect to feel good every single day, but you should also not dig yourself too far down a hole, because if you go on the other side, it will be
Overtraining.
it's much easier to dig a hole than to get out of the hole.
Yeah. And that also goes to the nuance of like between athletes. So I'm sure that you've noticed this, where some athletes kind of need that motivation and need that pep talk. Like, hey, you need to go out and you need to train really hard today. And then some athletes, it's like, hey, you're training a little bit too hard. You're working out a little bit too much and your intensity is a little bit too high. You need to back off a little bit.
Absolutely. And the answer exactly is it always depends on the individual athlete. And
Mm-hmm.
we see this now with all of this data becoming easily available. We can see that taper periods for athletes can vary between like 2 weeks to 4 weeks, just in how they, to get an optimal performance, you have a very different taper period between two different things. And that's where the individual coaching can start matter a lot, instead of just like, this is how we do it, boom, stamp it, this has worked for you know it's a very, very interesting part of sport. I think all endurance sports over the next 10 years will be, we'll get a lot more data, and we are going to see a lot more changes in individualization, and get a much better understanding of what's required for each different individual.
Oh yeah, and that brings up an interesting point between the sort of team-based approach and the individualized approach, because like I went to very high level high school running program and very high level college running program, but it was largely that team approach where it's like, well, this is what everybody's got to do, and some people just soaked up and absorbed that training so well. I mean, when I was in high school, we had a winner of the NXN and Gatorade Athlete of the Year. We had all of these extremely amazing runners. And it's like some people just absorbed that training exquisitely and then absorbed that taper period perfectly. And then some people got super injured. Like when I went to college, I was injured all the time. And so having that difference in approach based on that individual, and having wearables and technology that we didn't have when I was in high school and college can sometimes make a big difference. I mean, I know I didn't always respond super great to taper periods because I was unable to sleep because I had so much energy. I was just bouncing off the walls, and I didn't feel like eating and all this stuff. And sometimes my best efforts, my best running times came from those times where I was in really high training loads.
No, that's, I mean, super interesting, right? Because there is no doubt in my mind that it's beneficial to be a part of a good team. It
Totally.
makes you want to go. It makes you have fun. It makes you be a group that all strives for the best things, like you all drive each other to be better. But there's also that important thing for the coach to listen to their athletes there and be like, I'm start noticing a pattern. I start noticing a trend. Our team is super successful. We are doing great. But this athlete here underperforms there, or this athlete here underperforms at those start. And now, before we were sort of just, especially in skiing, right, guessing, because we don't have that exact data as runners have, where you're like, oh, you run this fast, now you're running slower, right? In skiing, it was like, well, I had this race or whatever, but now we're starting to get all of this data input into the sport, where we can see that, like, oh, this is going great, but I need to do this slight modification for this athlete for a big race or whatever, right? I need to do this because they can't. And again, this is often at a higher level, where at the high school level, you're more seeing all these random things that teenagers do, and it's okay, it's totally fine. Like, teenagers should do random things, but
Yeah.
like no, they have to learn from themselves, like that goldfish isn't the best lunch before race or now it
Sometimes
sounds like I'm totally down on goldfish, but like, I'm just example, that's maybe not the most fully nutrition meal that you
Olaf,
can
don't you
have.
know they're made with real cheese? I mean, come
Yeah,
on, what
yeah,
more could you ask
exactly.
for?
Should be fine, right?
A
um
goldfish, maybe an espresso before the race, and you'll be
yeah,
ready
then you're
ready to
good to
go.
go.
So some of those wearables can give us good input on the variables that can be a measure of how that athlete is adapting to the training. But some variables that we can modify, you brought up nutrition a couple of times already with the goldfish and stuff like that. But what are some of the nutritional advice that you would give to some of your athletes, whether that be for fueling during races, after races, things like that?
So first of all, I have to say I am not a nutritionist. My nutritional understanding is about the same as my understanding of anatomy. So we gotta, start with that. But I have lived some decades around top level performers, and there are some rule of thumbs that's used in the world of the best skiers in the world. It's a very interesting there's one especially from Norway that I love. I think it's so we got to realize like the top cross-country skiers, and this is covered many times, right, have a training volume 900 to 1,100 hours ish, 800 probably, maybe a little bit if you're more sprinter focused, but we're talking relatively high training volume in generally in just measured in hours, slightly less than a professional road biker, because they're in a closed chain environment with no impact. But we have very low impact, but we're not in a closed chain environment. And then we have runners who's probably a little bit less, because everyone at the top tries to train as much as you can, your body can adapt to. Like no one is like, I'm going to leave 100 hours on the table because that's what I want to do, right? So to be able to handle that training load, Norwegian, this was 5-7 years ago, whatever, juniors had a rule. It might be a decade now. I'm getting old quick. After every workout, I eat within 3 minutes of my finishing workout. Like they have a drink belt with a snack in the drink belt, and they try to eat within 3 minutes of the finished workout. I'm not saying they're having a complete meal, but they try to get some sort of energy within 3 minutes. That's a little bit extreme, maybe, but if you get into that habit, you're not going to go 2 hours and be like, let me sit back in the van and not do it, and I see that if I look at the juniors that are internationally competitive, there's no one who doesn't eat right after the workout, right? Personally, I dislike the term, like there's that window, the nutrition window within 30 minutes after your workout. As a youth coach, I don't like to use the word window because it like signals something that closes and now you can miss it or whatever. I like to frame it as like an opportunity. So you have an ability to decrease your recovery period and recovery hours and increase adaptation. And so it's an opportunity to me that you should, eat within 30 minutes of finishing, or and then if you go the Norwegian, a little bit more extreme style, eat within 5 minutes and then eat at least something every half hour until you get a proper meal.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to not have these set in stone windows of opportunity for carbohydrate intake or protein intake and things like that. Because then you get that athlete who, it's been 35 minutes since my workout, I might as well just wait 2 or 3 hours. But we know physiologically, if we begin fueling very quickly after a bout of exercise, we can replenish glycogen stores much more quickly than if we waited 2 or 3 hours and then had the same amount of nutrient intake. So there is an opportunity, and we should be fueling as quickly as possible. And typically it should be a carbohydrate heavy refueling. I know a lot of people like carbohydrates are really not in vogue anymore. They they've become like demonized in like the health circles. Like no carbohydrates at all. There are people that are even saying carbohydrates are not a necessary nutrient and stuff like that. And it's like if you want to perform at a very high level in endurance sports, carbohydrates sure are a necessary nutrient. There is nobody that is really performing at super high levels in these high intensity endurance sports that isn't intaking a lot of carbohydrates. And I think a lot of the research that is being done in very high level cyclists and cross country skiers and runners, et cetera, is actually trending more towards even higher amounts and literally training the gastrointestinal system to absorb more carbohydrates during training so that you get more fueling even during training as opposed to just after or before and things like that. But that's more for
if we would take the amount of carbs a pro cross-country skier looks and put that on a normal person, they would probably think it's insane.
They'd probably throw up too.
yeah, that is more likely, right? It's that I think you talked about it on the previous podcast, but like Kipchoge obviously eat oatmeal before every marathon things, and I would say 90% of good cross-country skiers do that. If we go back 20 years, it was probably 99.5%. So it might have gone down a little, but yeah, it's the diet, again, not a nutritionist, but and there are people who can talk way more about this and at way more exact level than I can. But we see a very what's suitable for one person, right, is not, or a normal person is not what's suitable for a high level athlete. And just what you're saying, the carb intake is pretty absurd compared to a normal person. But you also are spending an absurd amount of time at extremely elevated heart rates doing something razor sharp or whatever, right? Or so it's the answer is it depends. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Then compared to what you're doing, it depends on what you're gonna eat.
Yeah, and this goes to that factor of nuance. If we're talking about general population person who's trying to just go out and have a fun cross country ski, like you shouldn't be pounding as many carbohydrates as someone who's really trying to perform at the highest level or at their highest level. In that scenario, what we're saying is, commensurate to the amount of load, commensurate to the amount of volume and intensity of your training, you need to have macronutrient intake in the form of carbohydrates as well as fats and proteins. If you're general population and you're going out for a half-hour leisurely cross-country ski, then that's a totally different ballgame, Exactly. So that's one thing that I really that I think is one of the interesting things that I love to feature and talk about on this podcast is nuance. And that's one of the reasons it's called the art of prevention and not the black and white science of prevention, because there are going to be differences between individuals and how they absorb nutrients, how they utilize nutrients, and their overall nutrient needs too.
Exactly. And that's the answer is almost always it depends, and it is not at all as sexy as being like, this is what you need to do. Do this and you will become nationally or internationally competitive. That's it. And I mean, that's very nice to sell books or to get ears and eyes on your videos, but it's often not reflecting reality, right? Because reality is much more nuanced than if we could all just follow this, boom, do this and you will become internationally on the podium in the world championships. I would guess a lot of people would want to follow that, right? but it all depends. Humans are very, very complex with very, very complex lives, and therefore the answer is almost always it depends, because it has to do with the individual.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And that's something that is definitely lost. And sometimes you even see, someone who performed at a really high level and then they go, well, this is what I did. So now this is what's going to help you. And it's like, no, you're a freak. Like you're
No, totally. Like, right,
yeah.
there could be a person with extremely good fitness, or very easy to adapt to, this type of cardiovascular training, but was lacking in this or whatever the other things. That's extremely good max speed, but it's lacking in this thing. And then they're like, this worked for me. I'm going to push everyone through the same method forward. And because I became, internationally competitive on this recipe, and therefore everyone should just do that. And it's like, you are not taking into account the differences between all these individuals. And as we're now getting a lot of data, I think we see that it much more differences than one might have expected, in terms of how people respond to different training.
Now, one thing that you kind of just mentioned is some people are born with certain gifts, certain natural talents, and certain natural strengths. In cross country skiing, it might be their sprint ability, their ability to produce power quickly, their endurance ability, their overall like fitness, or maybe they have a natural talent for their biomechanics and their actual technique in skiing. But one thing that we mentioned or talked about in our kind of pre-recording call was the development of very well-rounded athletes. And that's how you go to the next level is, I think that you said training the weak points, but then racing your strengths, right? What can you tell me
Yes,
about
so
the whole
this
well-rounded athlete?
this I could talk for another hour, and there will be a specific podcast just about me talking about well-rounded athletes as cross-country skiers, because in this season I think we have the perfect example, because it is so fascinating to me. The best female skier in the world right now is Jessie Diggins. She is American. She is leading the World Cup with like 200 points over Lynn Swan, or something like 200, close to. And then, there's a Swede in second place. So it's like, for me, with dual citizenship, Sweden and US, I'm like, yay. No, and she's such an amazing role model for an poster, athlete for cross-country skiing in the US. And if we look at her abilities and her, capacity, athletic profile, or however you want to see it, it is very, very fascinating, because she's the best in the world on maybe one thing, maybe two, like her technical downhill capacity. So at very, very high technical downhills, Fallen comes to mind, which has, she's probably faster than anyone else, but that would be it, and then her mental game is super strong. But if we look at her overall just fitness, she's not best in the world. There is Laukli, Claudel Daphne, Heidi Weng, Ebba Andersson probably has a higher VO2 capacity at any, in better fitness. If we look at technique, she does not have the best in the world. She's very open about this. There was a full page article in Sweden how much she was lagging behind the Swedish skiers in technique. And, if we look at max speed, she's not the best in the world. But she doesn't have a weakness. She can do literally everything at the top 5 level in the world, top 10. She has great fitness. She has the acceptable technique, and she has good speed, and her ability to sprint at the end of a race is unbelievable. Like, she can dig so deep, but she has all the components, and it has taken her years to get there. But she is by far the best skier in the world by not being best at anything, but not having a problem, like not having a weakness. And there, like, all I can say is, like, congrats, you're amazing. Like, you don't have these big deficiencies that the other your opponents or competitors or friends or whatever you want to call them can take advantage of. Like, you're good, like, you don't have a weak spot that someone can go and kill you on. And that's so fascinating and so cool to me. And I think this is something that when you develop high school skiers, and when you develop, you need to look at the whole component. What is your technique? And I like technique. I love talking about this and biomechanics a lot, because basic physics, you are trying to move a mass around the course, right? And we can just do force vectors and see where your biomechanics goes. And if it goes the wrong, like, it's a relatively black and white area of skiing. Like, this is a less effective force vector than this, right? This is more correctly going to accelerate the mass around the course. But as a coach for younger athletes, it's so important that you don't stare yourself blind on one of these things. Just like you're saying, someone might have great feel for the ski and putting good pressure on it, and skis really big. But, and to be perfectly honest, this is often alpine skiers coming to Nordic. They often have a very, very good feel for the ski, but they're lacking enormous in fitness, and they don't have the cardiovascular capacity to be competitive if they want to go up to a college or international level. Again, high school, different things. And if you take a runner, probably very good fitness, really, really good, but can't biomechanically move, that ski and putting the same pressure on a ski often. I'm not saying this is applicable to everyone all the time. I'm generalizing slightly here. But very good fitness, but might not have the technique that's required. And I think, or then we see someone who has like an enormous, ability to have speed at threshold and do very, very well at these hour races or hour or longer. And they have a really good speed at threshold, but they have no ability to have a speed reserve or speed capacity that when someone decides to ski away from them in a group, they can't do that surge or acceleration. And what Diggins have, and I think is so important, where she's showcasing right now, and it's beautiful, is that you don't need to be the best at everything, but you can't have these weaknesses. And as high school, when we teach our high school athletes or middle school athletes or younger athletes, we need to recognize that, okay, you are great at this, but for you to become internationally, you need to work on this area, or you need to work on this area, right? And we can't just say that, oh, fittest person wins, because it's not true. Fittest person doesn't always win. It happens. Krüger, Simon Hegstad Krüger won Olympics and could arguably be one of the fittest, but US ski team has stopped about 5-6 years ago to do VO2 max tests on their World Cup skiers, because there is no correlation between their VO2 max and their place in the World Cup. Once, if you have 85 or 95 as a male, it doesn't really make that difference for your World Cup. If you have 65 or 75 as a female, it's, that's not what's going to make that last thing. There's so many other things. Granted, all of them are very high numbers. There's no one who is there and has a really low number, right? So that's the thing. You need to have that whole package to become internationally competitive or towards the top in the country. And that's something that I think is so interesting in this sport, because it means that you will always have things to work on. And like best skier in the world still has best female skier in the world, like still has a ton of things that she can improve and get even better at, and it's super cool.
Yeah, and I think you brought up some really interesting points because as a coach, it's probably really easy to take that high school athlete and say, "Oh, you have great endurance. We're going to work on your endurance more, and we're just going to put you in really long races, you know? And we're just going to let you excel, and we're going to build on that strength." And sometimes it's tough when you only have a short amount of training time and all of these other variables with these high school athletes. It's tough to say, okay, well, today we're going to work on your technical ability, or today we're going to work on your turnover and your sprint speed. I see this, you see this with running all the time too. You get some kid who, maybe didn't play soccer, didn't play football, or things where you have to have a lot of foot speed. And then you're like, oh, you just have a good engine. So you're going to be a 2-miler, and that's
Yeah.
all you're going to do, And sometimes like you should work on that kid's foot speed, because you never know what could happen as they go through those developmental changes like puberty and things like that. Like that person could change and they could develop that foot speed and then be a really great 800 or 400 meter runner. And the same thing goes for in the 2-mile, or when they go to college, like in the 5K and things like that. At the end of those races, you have to be able to run a 50-second quarter in college in order to be a contender for a 3,000 meter or a 5,000 meter national title. That's just what it is
Yeah,
now. You
absolutely.
you can't have these weak points. It's if
And
you're
that's,
go ahead.
sorry I
No,
interrupted,
no,
but
yeah.
you're absolutely right. Unless the athlete is like, this is my last year, after this, I am not racing anymore. And what I want from you as a coach is to optimize my performance this year. So when I sit back and am a retired college kid, I can look back and be happy that I crushed out the most I could during my senior year in high school or whatever, right? That's one other case. But otherwise, it's hard, just like you're saying, to become nationally competitive. You need to finish with a 50 to 52, whatever, 400, something like that. I again, not an expert on track and field like that,
Well,
but
I'm not an expert anymore either. So,
and the speed that is required to be competitive at, if we're talking about just a pure engine guy person, right? They need to develop their speed, because the high speed that is required at the international level or NCAA level is just so high comparatively. And as a coach, I think one of the biggest mistakes we can do is to look at individuals and be like, I want you to maximize your performance here, right now, and not be like, hey, I want to build you as an athlete over the next 10 years. So when you leave me, or whatever, if you're a junior coach or whatever, senior, you have a face so you can become, have the athletic career you want over the next 10 years. Because hopefully your career is, if that's what you want, to have a long, successful career, it's impossible to become a competitive runner without a high max speed. It's impossible to become a competitive runner without a high engine or decent. It's impossible to become a competitive runner without the correct biomechanics. Same things, you can't be a skier without max speed, without the correct biomechanics, without these things. So as the coach for younger athletes, juniors, it's really a lot about making sure that they don't have these deficiencies. than trying to optimize their capacity in this one part of the sport where they will do really well right now, right? So completely agree, or that's, fits in with what I have seen over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. And so Olaf, we're coming up to about an hour of interviewing here, and I always like to finish these podcasts kind of the same way. And I like to think about, this famous saying from this guy, Benjamin Franklin. And what he said was an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we've talked about a ton of different things today. We talked about fueling. We talked about wearables. We talked about the progression of the U.S. in cross-country skiing and all this great stuff. But if we had to synthesize that information into a couple of minutes or a couple of, you could say, ounces of prevention, what would we distill that information into? What are your ounces of prevention for any athletes or coaches or clinicians that may be listening for, the cross-country skiing or endurance sports in general?
Well, don't minimize the complexity of the individual. That would be my short answer to that. I would like to I'm gonna put you on the spot, do a little test here with how much you know about cross-country skiing. For
oh boy.
any listener here can try to answer as well. So cross country has two techniques, right? It has classic and skate. Within each there is sub techniques. On the total, how many techniques do a cross country skier have to learn?
Well, didn't you say there are like 9 different sub-disciplines?
Maybe I told you. Correct. That is correct. We can respect any answer between 9 and 11. So it depends on if you take up striding into striding and Klæbo and a V1 to V1 and V1 hop. But so we have 9 to 11 different biomechanical movements you have to learn. Very, very compared to if we swimming and they're all 3-dimensional, has 4 plus the underwater, so there's a couple there, but it's a very high task, very high demand on the cardiovascular system, on top of that very complex biomechanics. So if you are a coach or someone who works with a cross-country skier, don't understand the complexity of it and view it from an overall, and it sounds so cliche, but like you got to look at the whole picture.
Don't lose the forest for the trees, right?
Like you have to look at the whole pictures, because if you don't do the correct, like the injury risk and the burnout risk and the things, if you're just pressing on one single issue in this sport, it will, I can't say it will, but the risk of you burning out athletes or getting them injured, or if you're an athlete just like that, you want to stop and not do the sport anymore, take into the complexity of the sport and understand that there's always something that can be improved, and with building that whole thing, you will become much more resilient to injury than if you're just looking at one or 2 things, and especially in juniors. But that's like the one thing I say from juniors to World Cup skiers, that like the whole picture and understanding the complexity of it is the key thing to injury prevention, I would say, in cross-country skiing.
So the biggest things are look out for those nuances, those individual variances that make everybody so special and unique. And then kind of look at variability as a means to train without overtraining. Would you say that's a pretty good?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, Olaf, this was super fun. And we'll be talking later, but we'll definitely have to have you on to talk more about coaching and all of these specific things again in the future. So thank you so much again, and we'll be talking again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Nick.
I hope that you enjoyed this episode of the Art of Prevention podcast. If you did enjoy and or benefit from some of the information in this podcast, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share this podcast. Or please give us a 5-star review on any platform that you find podcasts. One thing to note, that this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. No patient is formed, and if you are having any difficulty, pain, discomfort, etc. with any of the movements or ideas described within this podcast, please seek the help of a qualified and board-certified medical professional, such as your medical doctor or a sports chiropractor, physical therapist, etc.